The Portuguese language. Have you ever thought why it has turned into what it is today? Where did it come from? Who were the first people to speak it? Which connections between peoples and land have helped it to be built in its own nature? These are some curiosities I'm going to tell you about, and some others I'm sure you've never heard of. If you're new to this channel, subscribe to it, activate all notifications, and I'll appreciate much if you like this video too. Come with me. The history of the Portuguese language. The Portuguese language, the last flower of Latin, rustic and beautiful, as the Brazilian poet Olavo Bilac once described language. The native language to 244 million people, spoken in 9 different countries, over all the 5 continents, the Portuguese language has long been maturing and shaping culture to become today the 5th most spoken language of our time. How has it made its way to these days? What are its origins? Where does its vocabulary come from? What has shaped their sounds? Our history begins a long way away from now, and I'd like to invite you in this journey. Our story didn't start thousands of years ago, but all this time is important to have some understanding of what has happened to make Portuguese the language it is today. Let's begin from the beginning. I'll take you back to as far as 400,000 years, to the very beginning, because that was the time when traces of the first kinds of humans lived in our planet. After some long time, eventually the Neanderthal came. However, it was only about 35,000 years ago that the Homo sapiens lived. And you might be asking yourself whether there is need to go that far back to have our story told. Trust me, that's the length of time when it all began. And sometime recently, and by recently I mean over 3,000 years ago, some peoples started to live and change their surrounding and shape a new culture, and started to speak then what has turned out to be modern Portuguese language. For all this long period, these ancient peoples left traces in what is called today the Iberian Peninsula. We know these facts because of anthropological studies. They left not only tools, but also remaining bones of their course. That's why we can study them. However, what we don't actually know is how the first groups of people came to live there. Among those peoples, some are still there today. The Lusitanians, the Turdiles, the Ostremanus, the Sinaites, they were the first to establish their homes along this area. After them, Celtic tribes came from the Caucasus and the Germanic lands. And again, it's not that clear the reason why the Celtic spread across Europe. We know that they roamed the continent for an entire millennium before Christ. In their journey, they settled and intermarried with the local population they happened to find along their paths. It resulted in some other new ethnic groups and many other tribes. Again, other layers of peoples arose, culture and language developed. Their presence is also traceable in broad outline through archaeological and linguistic evidence. They spoke Celtiberian and Galician. These 2 forms of speaking are the very root of what today's Portuguese language has become. Hundreds of years of interactions, sharing joy, fear, expectation, growing crops and bringing up families. They were continuously building their story. They peopled the west seaboard of the European side, more specifically the Iberian Peninsula in the southeast corner of Europe at the westernmost edge of Eurasia. This region was named after the ancient inhabitants, whom the Greeks called Iberians, probably from Ibrum. the peninsula's second longest river after the river Tigris. However, just as you probably have read in books or seen in films or heard around, ancient history was not a time when people were able to live peacefully. They needed food, and for food, land was needed. To get land, there were usually wars, until the newcomers could settle down and farm the fields. However, one specific people developed a brand new strategy. The Romans conquered land not only to grow crops, but to rule other people and collect taxes. 218 years before Jesus' birth, the Roman army overwhelmed Hispania. This is how that portion of land was called then. This period is known as the time of the Punic Wars. There were 3 Punic Wars in total. The Romans were trying to get hegemony over the Western Mediterranean, starting in Sicily and then Hispania. They wanted to have control over Carthage, current Tunisia. Carthaginians had power over this land, and especially the port, and the Roman Empire was eager to defeat them. It took 3 Punic Wars. In the second, though, they conquered the Iberian Peninsula. The Roman Empire then pacified the Galician, one of the major tribes who lived where now is Spain and Portugal. The empire didn't have enough souls to populate the conquered land. Instead, they had an ingenious solution to the problem: kill off resistance, build infrastructure like roads and bridges, and govern their new people, and of course, collect taxes. The majority of these new people were Roman soldiers, or at least sent by Rome. Most soldiers spoke colloquial Latin. That's how Latin started to be used by common people. It spread quickly also because it was a sign of prestige to use the language of the new rulers. The origin of the name Portugal is rather interesting. Qual was a prosperous city at the mouth of the Douro River. Qual meant port in the Celtic language. This port was of great importance to the Roman Empire, and so they renamed it to Portus Qual, or Qual Port, which would mean port. Anyway, the building of this port was so relevant to the region that its name spread to the whole region. That's how Portugal got its name from. As for the port, later on they excluded the Qual part from its name and it became Portus only, or the current city of Porto. At this point then, the geographical scenario of what one day was about to become the Portuguese language was already set. The new language form then, the Galician, was a mix of local dialects and vulgar Latin. Even today, modern Portuguese and Galician have no trouble understanding one another. The birth of a people. This interaction between locals and peoples from the Roman Empire lasted for 700 years, going up to the 5th century of our modern times. Then it eventually came to an end due to the fall of the empire. The Iberian Peninsula was then a completely different place from that one the Romans met. When they left, they had let their religion Christianism. Then clergymen from the new Roman Church interacted with locals. Again, new Latin vocabulary was spread among locals. So after other 700 years of ruling, the language of Christian religion had already been settled. However, ancient times was a continuous battle for lands. East Germanic tribes overran the empire. Today we commonly name these people the Vikings, although this name has been disputed. There are many reasons that can help us understand why they decided to leave their northern land and started plundering the southern land. One of these reasons is that they were not strange to the empire. They were facing land shortage due to climate change and population pressure. If that was not bad enough, the Huns were bringing chaos to the northern lands. The Huns were a very aggressive people that lived in Central Asia, current Kazakhstan. Their most famous leader, Attila, is considered one of the most bellicose generals of army ever. The Huns tormented the north for 2 centuries. The Vikings instead looted for 300 years. We call this period the Barbarian Migrations. One of these people, the Swabians, occupied the southern part of the Roman province of Galatia, to the north of the Douro River, and expanded into the province of Lusitania, where central Portugal is now. They eventually took control over most of the Iberian Peninsula. During the same time, the Visigothic kingdom expanded from its original settlement in southern France, occupying most of the Iberian Peninsula that was not populated by the Swabians. Again, this was a time when local tribes shared the same place with the newcomers. And again, culture, custom, and language were affected. However, invasion didn't cease. The control by the descendants of the Germanic tribes endured until a new invasion happened. The Muslim people crossed the Mediterranean Sea, coming from Africa, and they managed to take control over the Iberian Peninsula. The Muslims attacked the land in 1711. Then they ruled over parts of the land for another 6 centuries. However, through this time, the area that was not to become Portugal retained major administrative boundaries that broadly reflected the earlier Roman provincial organization. Traditionally, Portugal's emergence as a separate kingdom is dated back to 1139, when Alfonso Henriques, Count of Portugal, began using the title of king after defeating the Muslims in the Battle of Urique. His title was formally conceded in 1179 when he placed Portugal under the protection of the Roman Church. At the time, European nations had only existed under the protection of the Holy See, the Catholic Church in Rome. The birth of a language. World-famous Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes once called the Portuguese language the sweet and gracious language, and Spanish writer Lope de Vega named it sweet as well. Also, Brazilian songwriter Caetano Veloso asks in his song Tongue, Língua, o que quer e pode essa língua, or what is this language will and way, but I must say sorry for this totally impossible translation. Now let's embark to the very journey of this video to discover how the Portuguese language came to be what it is. We have already seen that pre-Celtic groups like the Lusitanians, Tardilus, Outremenes, and Sinaites, among others, merged their culture and language. Then, when Romans came to live in the Iberian lands, they brought in not one, but 2 kinds of Latin. The official Latin, which was used especially in documents and by high-rank officers. The other was called Common Latin or Vulgar Latin, spoken by Roman soldiers. This kind of more colloquial speech spread fast because it was then considered a prestige language to be spoken. So then Vulgar Latin merged into the local language. New words were introduced because empire came and brought several developments, and locals' lexicon needed to meet new language requirements. In the 9th century, the first administrative documents were written in Galician Portuguese. It was so important for the making of the language that it is considered the Proto-Portuguese, or something that would resemble to something that can be recognized as a language to be. This period lasted for 300 years. By the 13th century, Galician Portuguese had become a mature language with its own literature and began to split into 2 languages. However, the debate of whether Galician and Portuguese are nowadays varieties of the same language, much like American English or British English, is still present. In all aspects, phonology, morphology, lexicon and syntax Portuguese is essentially the result of an organic evolution of Vulgar Latin with some influences from other languages, namely the native Galician and Lusitanian languages spoken prior to the Roman domination. This period extended from the 12th to the 14th century. Galician Portuguese was increasingly used for documents and other written forms. For some time, it was the language of preference for lyric poetry and Christian Hispania. It is also relevant to mention the contribution of the Occitan, a much liked language of the poetry of the troubadours in France. The Occitan language digraphs y and ny used in its classical orthography were adopted by the orthography of Portuguese. It was presumably done by Gerald of Braga, a monk from the city of Moissac in the south of France, who became Bishop of Braga in Portugal in 1047. Braga played a major role in modernizing written Portuguese using classical Occitan norms. Portugal became an independent kingdom in 1139 under King Alfonso I of Portugal. In 1290, King Denis of Portugal created the first Portuguese university in Lisbon, the Estudos Gerais or General Studies, which later was moved to Coimbra, and the king decreed for Portuguese, then simply called the common language of the people. So it started being used for speaking unofficially. So this period that started with Proto-Portuguese and the Galician Portuguese was necessary to bring some maturity of the language. Summing up, this period lasted for 500 years, half a millennium for the Portuguese language to be ready to move on to the next stage, Old Portuguese. Old Portuguese is recognized by an important event, the publication in 1516 of Cancioneiro Geral, translated as the General Book of Songs. Garcia de Rezende compiled this massive work of over 200 authors in both Castilian and Portuguese languages, whose work spanned the second half of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th. It covered a wide range of themes: love poetry, satire, epigrams, religious and epic historical verse. The author's aim was to celebrate contemporary and past Portuguese achievements, and the Cancioneiro Geral marks the transition between medieval and classical Portuguese literature. Get below the link to listen to the Portuguese diva Amália Rodrigues singing one of the most famous poems from Cancioneiro Geral, Cantiga Sua Partindo-se, by João Ruiz de Castelo Branco. Garcia de Rezende's work had a deep influence on what the Portuguese language would become afterwards. The language started then to be characterized by an increase in the number of words borrowed from Classical Latin and Classical Greek because of the Renaissance. Learned words borrowed from Latin also came from Renaissance Latin, the form of Latin during that time, which greatly enriched the lexicon. Most literate Portuguese speakers were also literate in Latin, and thus they easily adopted Latin words into their writing and eventually into their speech in Portuguese. Then the age of the discovery came. During the centuries 15th and 16th, Old Portuguese was taken to the New World and to other parts where Portuguese sailors managed to find along our planet. Being spread for over 200 years, Old Portuguese was taken to many regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese had become a lingua franca in Asia and Africa, used not only for colonial administration and trade, but also for communication between local officials and Europeans of all nationalities. Its spread was helped by mixed marriages between Portuguese and local people, and by its association with Roman Catholic missionary efforts, which led to the formation of Creole languages such as that called Christian in many parts of Asia, from the word cristão, Christian. The language was popular in parts of Asia until the 19th century. Some Portuguese-speaking Christians community in India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia and Indonesia preserved their language even after they were isolated from Portugal. Listen to this poem written by Fernando Pessoa, the greatest Portugal poet. It's a free translation on my own, and again I must say sorry for my poor translation. Portuguese sea, oh salty sea, so much of whose salt is Portugal tears. All the mothers who had to weep for us to cross you, all the sons who prayed in vain, all the brides-to-be who never married for you to be ours. Oh sea, was it worth doing? Everything is worth doing if the soul of the doer isn't little. Whoever would go beyond the cape must go beyond sorrow. God placed danger and the abyss in the sea, but He also made it heaven's mirror. I'm also going to let a link to the song from Cesaria Evra singing in Cape Verdean Creole. You'll find captions in her language and English too. In 1572, Luís Vaz de Camões published the Lusíads. It was widely regarded as the most important work of Portuguese literature and marks the beginning of modern Portuguese. The epic poem celebrates the discovery of the sea route to India by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. The Lusíads is often regarded as the Portugal's national epic, much as Virgil's Aeneid was for the ancient Romans, or Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were for ancient Greeks. As we have seen, the Portuguese language took its chance and spread to the colonies. Today's Portuguese has a number of words derived from the discovery times. As a major colonial and trading nation, Portugal came into close contact with many other cultures and languages, and words from these sources also contributed to the range and color of the Portuguese lexicon. Nowadays, only 5% of Portuguese speakers live in Portugal. The language is official in 9 countries, making up 255 million speakers all over the world. Portuguese is also spoken by at about 678,000 people in the United States, with large communities of speakers in the states of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. A powerful and beautiful language as Portuguese is, it has taken 2,000 years to evolve to what it is today. A work still in progress. We can barely grasp what it will be in the future. To end this story, I'd like to ask you to share with us the most beautiful words in Portuguese you know. I've got some suggestions, but of course you can add yours. Saudades, fofinho, espelhar, luar, cafuné. Which are your words? Write in the comments. Talking about that, I'll be preparing another video telling you how Brazilian and Portugal Portuguese differ. There is here a peculiar company to this account, the English language, but I'm not going to give you any spoiler now. I hope you liked this video and thanks for watching.